Hi, this is titled A Simple Clarity. In contrast to the many controversies and complexities and lack of clarity that we may experience or observe, focus can be very simple. There's no anxious clinging to a preoccupation about how something should be or should not be. There's just a relaxed alertness about a particular interest. There can be a sequence of interests. There's no clinging to one particular interest. There's just the focus or the priority at any particular moment. The subject of interest can be presented by someone else, like I'm speaking to those who are listening. There can be encouragement to be attentive to one topic or even a specific sequence of topics as in a prepared program. There's different kinds of encouragement. The encouragement can take the form of social reinforcements and a large variety of different ways of motivating people beyond their own internal motivations. So focus is very familiar, but clarity may seem familiar. It may seem so common that we think, oh, of course I know what is meant by a simple clarity. But let's consider that in so many cases, clarity isn't the actual subject of interest. That's not where the focus is. There is a focus, but the focus is not clarity. So I mentioned that someone can present a subject of interest to someone else. And there can be clarity, like the person talking can be clear, the person or people listening can be clear, but that can end. The issue of clarity may not last long unless there's a private conversation in which everyone in the interaction is alert to the clarity of everyone else. So there's time for exchange. Even in private conversations, people may stop listening and yet not interrupt. So they're not listening, but they didn't notify the other person that they're not listening. They're having their own internal conversation while the other person's talking, maybe thinking that they're being listened to, but maybe not. So one person can also keep talking with so little alertness to the other person that the one talking doesn't notice that the other one isn't listening. And then when they find out the other one isn't listening, there's this awkward transition of finding out. How long have you not been listening? So one person can keep talking with so little alertness to the other person that they do not notice that the other one is not listening, while the other one fails to effectively indicate that they are no longer listening. So it's not necessarily what you would call a conversation at that point. There's talking, but is there really an exchange, a conversation? And in some cases, one person may even pretend to still be listening even though they're not. Or they may pretend to understand what's being said to them even though that's not the case. So in contrast to attentive private interactions, not necessarily between two people, but including between two people, there's a process of a small group creating a program of topics for a large group. It could be a single person creating a program of topics for a large group. So when creating a school curriculum, the small group the small group that's guiding the selection process of what goes in the curriculum and what is the actual sequence, that group isn't interested in each of the individuals who are the targets of the programming. When some employee of a TV station is selecting what programs to put into a schedule or how to change a schedule, or maybe they're going to consider changing the programs that are part of a TV schedule, are they interested in each of the individuals that will be the audience of that TV network? No. The person creating school curriculum, again, they're not interested in the individual children. They can have the exact same curriculum year after year, class after class, or almost the exact same curriculum. That's the nature of curriculums. So the small group is programming a large target audience. Here are the topics to be interested in. There may be little or no interest by the powerful group in the specific responses of individuals. So what a particular individual experiences when they're watching a TV program, or what a particular individual experiences when they're part of a educational training program, a school program, those individual responses may be of no interest at all or very little interest to the powerful group creating those programs and implementing those programs, or publicizing those programs. So intermediaries such as teachers and teaching supervisors, they may be trained in certain duties that are their primary focus, and then the teachers and teaching supervisors may be monitored for their effectiveness. So their basic duty is to deliver educational programming and then monitor the responsiveness of individuals and groups. So the people making the curriculum, they don't monitor directly, but they may have associates who do some monitoring, right? When the individuals are responding outside of the typical range for their group, then those individuals may get identified and receive some extra attention, such as detention, after school detention, because they were disruptive to class or something like that. So typical consequences for the unusual student is that the individual can be transferred to another class if it's a pretty big gap between that individual's response to the curriculum and that's the response that's typical in the rest of that classroom. So then a student could be transferred to another class. A student could be transferred to another school, or even suspended and expelled. In other words, the personal relationship between the individuals, the teacher, and the student is not the primary focus. If one student fails to meet certain standards, then the school as an institution just sorts those people out and processes them according to their predetermined policies and rituals. They might try to integrate them into some other special classroom, or they send them off to some other institution, which once again won't be fundamentally committed to the response of that individual student. They're going to be the students will be related to within the rituals of the institution. So there's an institutional interests, and the students will be related to not as being the most important individual in the classroom. They're just one of many individuals in the classroom, and certainly the most important individual in the classroom in most classrooms is the teacher from the perspective of the institution. So the job of the teacher. The job of each teacher is to obediently serve a role, a specific role defined and assigned by the institution. So an effective teacher in mainstream schools is one who conforms to the program of the curriculum and who consistently keeps the students in conformity with the guidelines of the curriculum. So the ideal teacher's focus ultimately is not on the individual students, but on the curriculum of the institution and the politics of the institution and the policies of the institution. They conform to the policies of the institution that employs them. That's how they keep their job. So each student is rewarded for following along with the sequence of topics in the programming and then repeating memorized content at the time and in the way directed. So students who are bored by a particular pace of instruction that is disappointingly slow to them, or maybe that they're having trouble with an instructional pace that's too fast, those students will be ignored first, and then if they're disruptive, they'll be punished for being disruptive. In many cases, they'll be punished for being disruptive. If they display their competence before the teacher requests it, in the case that the instructional pace is too slow, and a student displays competence before the teacher, requests it, they can get in trouble. They wait till the teacher asks the question and then raise your hand and then wait for the teacher to call on you before you answer. The competence of the individual student just isn't the focus. Conformity, compliance, those are essential to a traditional mainstream classroom. So full comprehension of the class material, how important is that? Full comprehension of the class material by each individual is not a primary issue. If the student can perform well on multiple choice tests or whatever other evaluation ritual is used, then they pass. That means the target has been met. What's the target? That the student take the test and pass it. That's really it. There are some other things that certainly schools want to have attendance. They are paid in proportion to the number of students they have in many cases. The attendance of the individual students will affect how much the school itself gets paid. So attendance is maybe even, we could say, the primary interest of the schools. They want to promote attendance. In many classes, if a student raises questions that might threaten the perception that specific content is accurate or well established in terms of it being a fact, rather than in terms of being accurate rather than being speculative, then likely those students would be punished by raising questions that are threatening to the institution's interests. Voicing skepticism is not part of the program. Voicing confusion about an inconsistency is not part of the program. So you don't point out inconsistencies. Students will not be encouraged to point out inconsistencies and may be considered disruptive and may be punished from a disciplinary standpoint. They may be strongly discouraged socially from making reference to inconsistencies or logical gaps. For the student to voice confusion is bad. For a student to say, I'm confused about blah, 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 that's going to be discouraged. The idea is whether or not you're comprehending the material, shut up, sit down, listen, and then when we instruct you to repeat back to us the memorized content, repeat back to us the memorized content. That's the basic format of at least a lot of schools. If the student's confused, yes, please, the teachers will say, yes, please ask for help. But the teachers want the students to ask them for help about issues that are part of the curriculum and that the teacher knows how to address. The teacher doesn't want students bringing up questions that also confuse the teacher and challenge the teacher to learn, or in many cases, teachers will definitely not want to have their lack of comprehension of subject material, uh, you know, come to the attention of anyone, students included. Just as a note, teachers aren't paid to be experts in their subject areas that they're teaching. That's not why they're hired. What are teachers paid to do? What are they hired to do? They're paid to program the students with doctrines about science and history and so on. Teachers are not trained to be experts in the field they are teaching, and the target of the whole institution is not to produce experts. It's not to produce people who are extremely thorough researchers when it comes to finding inconsistencies in history and science and so on, and then establishing what's accurate. That's just not the focus of these institutions. The target is compliance. So if students become deeply confused about certain issues in a particular curriculum, how interested is the system in their confusion? How interested is the system in the student comprehending isolated issues? The system doesn't care if the student has questions about 5% of the subject matter or 25% of the subject matter, because they don't care what questions the student has. This is a really interesting way to frame it. The system doesn't care what questions the students have. The system cares how well can the students answer the questions that the system presents in the evaluation rituals. The system, in the case that a student is deeply confused, they'll be given a certain amount of remedial attention. This is what the textbook says. Are you clear that that's what it says? Okay, doesn't matter if you have questions about the underlying accuracy of this stuff. This is what the textbook says. So that's what we will reward you for repeating. So are you clear that we're rewarding you for memorizing content and then repeating it? And then if the student's clear on that, then they can play along with that process, or perhaps they won't. But that's what the system will encourage, is for students to memorize specific content without regard necessarily for the student's questions. And then can the student answer the questions quickly that the teacher asks based on the curriculum that's made by some external small group. So if a student's deeply confused about a couple of issues, they might get a little remedial attention, but basically the classroom is going to move on. The system, the curriculum goes from one topic to the next topic. They have a certain amount of time for each topic, and if students have additional interest in a particular topic, that's irrelevant. They can explore that on their own time. The system doesn't care what individual students are interested in. The system doesn't care what individual students are, what their questions might be, what they're skeptical about, what they're confused about, what they're intrigued about. The system doesn't track that. The system doesn't reward students for good questions. There is an element of rewarding students for certain kinds of questions and certain kinds of research procedures, but within a specific framework or a specific limit, within a specific range. So critical thinking within a specific range is going to be encouraged, but to encourage critical thinking in general, what does that have to do with mainstream schooling? So in some cases, raising an open controversy about whether a particular answer on a test is accurate could be encouraged. An individual teacher might invite students to raise controversies about the accuracy of a particular answer key item. So the teachers are just given tests, and the teachers are given answer keys. And if there is a error on the answer key, the teacher may go, "Oh yes, that is an error. There's a misprint on the answer key." Or in other cases, it may be that the answer key in the primary text of the classroom reports a particular idea or doctrine that has come into controversy, or maybe has been reversed in terms of what the school system itself recognizes as valid, as worthy of reward. In addition to typing errors in terms of misprints in the textbook or the answer key, there's also issues where the entire curriculum has something wrong, and some teachers will encourage students to raise controversies and explore critical thinking and find out what really is credible, in addition to what's going to get you a reward on the multiple choice test. So an individual teacher or an individual supervisor of teachers may encourage comprehension and critical thinking. That certainly does happen. However, the system is likely to ignore those employees at first. Here's what the system knows what it values, and what those employees are doing isn't part of what the system values. So if they get too distracted by those off-topic, low-value issues, then the system will penalize them. So the system ignores employees first, ignores employees who promote comprehension and critical thinking. The systems will ritually reward blind conformity, not only in the students, but in the employees. And eventually, if it's disruptive to the greater process, then the system will filter out employees and fire them if they are focused too much on promoting clarity in individual students. If the teachers focus too much on individual students, that's a problem. If they're focused too much on promoting critical thinking and comprehension and skepticism and intelligence, that's going to be a mismatch in terms of what the values of the school system are. The school system rewards memorization, conformity. At least in my personal experience with school systems as a student and as a teacher. And also my experience outside of mainstream school systems as an instructor, where the comprehension of the students, or where the same kind of pressures and interests were not present. So the anti-skepticism bias of public schools wasn't a factor in certain instructional positions that I've held. There was no bias against that. Again, there just wasn't any particular interest, in many cases. There was no specific interest. If an instructor was interested in an individual student's clarity, that's fine. It's just not part of, it's not the primary focus. But it won't necessarily be punished as it might be in a traditional school. So promoting individual clarity is simply not the target of institutional programming. This isn't to say that institutional programming doesn't have value. Obviously, there's tremendous value, or else you wouldn't have so much institutional programming for so many decades, more and more intense over so many different parts of the world. Obviously, there have been a variety of different approaches, but we can see, generally speaking, throughout the world, very similar approaches. Lots of central government regulated schools. Also, lots of government operated schools and government funded schools, of course. So you've got government regulation of schools, that first layer, then government funding of schools gives the government even more power, and then when the government actually directly operates schools, wow, that's going to be a match for pro-government bias. Why is there so much pro-government propaganda by all of these governments all over the world that have very different systems? Why do they all promote their own system? Because the governments regulate, fund, and operate, in many cases, those school systems. So promoting individual clarity is simply not the target of institutional programming. What is the target? Conformity is the target, which is why conformity is measured and rewarded. In science and history classes, conformity to repeating programmed ideas is what is rewarded. The behaviors of speaking and writing are programmed. Here's what you read, here's what you say, here's what you write, here's the way you write it, and so on. It's all programmed. That's what it is. So in certain classes like art, as in contrast to science and history, which are language oriented, in an art class, students may be rewarded for patterning other kinds of behaviors as instructed. So if they draw what they're assigned to draw, even quite poorly, then the student may still get the highest grade possible. Why? Because they conform to the topic of the assignment. Not that their performance or their skill level was even decent. It could be quite low, but students can be rewarded for participating. Students can be rewarded for just conforming to the assignment. We can think about the different kinds of classrooms, like special needs classrooms and classrooms where reading level standards are extremely low. So you might have students who are 8 years old or 12 years old or 15 years old, but reading that's not central to the operation of the classroom in many cases, or in certain cases. So there are cases where reading levels are, not. If a student has a really high reading level in certain classes, they'll be moved out of that class, right? So students notice over time that conformity in words and conformity in actions is rewarded. Class after class, year after year, teacher after teacher, school after school, conformity is rewarded. So the focus is not on the clarity or competence of each individual. The focus is on participation within the system and according to the values of the system. So students may even be given acknowledgement certificates simply for participation. Even if their performance levels were far below average, they get a certificate for participation. They get a good citizenship reward for being quiet. They get a good attendance award just for showing up consistently. All of those are not demonstrations of competence. They're not demonstrations of critical thinking. They're not being rewarded for questions that really challenge the system. Of course not. Why would an institution reward students for challenging the institution? That's disruptive. So how much actual consequence will there be for the teachers depending on the lifelong results of their individual students? In other words, if students do well for their whole lives, will that make a difference for the teachers who taught those students in contrast to students who don't do well? I think of an example here of a guitar teacher. So there's a very famous guitar teacher in the last few decades, a fellow named Joe Satriani, who not only became well known as a guitar teacher, but became well known as well as a guitar player. And Joe Satriani became popular, in some part at least, because his students were so skilled. His students were so skilled that they were unusually successful and they were unusually profitable as guitarists in terms of performance musicians. So the guitarist from Metallica is a fellow named Kirk Hammett. Actually, there's another guitarist, if you count James Hetfield, but Kirk Hammett, I know, took lessons from Joe Satriani. And so people who were fans of a very popular group, in that case Metallica, might know that the guitarist in Metallica took lessons from Joe Satriani. And because of the success of Joe Satriani's students, he eventually became famous and did have financial benefit from it. But he didn't collect an interest of the royalties or an interest of the profits from Steve Vai and Kirk Hammett and some of the other famous guitarists that he instructed, or successful guitarists. Whether how famous they are is a different issue, I guess. But the point is, some of the guitarists he instructed were very financially successful, and he didn't get a percentage of their profits. He might have gotten some gifts or something, but he did get eventually famous, and that, I'm sure, converted into profits for him. So that's an unusual case. It's an exceptional case. In the vast majority of cases, the skill levels of the students and the success of the students, financially or otherwise, have no lasting consequence for their instructors or teachers. Typically, there's no consequence for the teachers if they teach a student who does unusually well or unusually poorly. There's typically no difference in the teacher's life in the long run. There's no financial compensation difference. Generally speaking, there's no difference. The teacher is primarily their primary relationship in the school system is with the institution itself, not maybe with some of the other teachers and the supervisors, not so much with students that they'll see for 9 months and then probably very little, if ever, again after that. So after 9 months of interactions, most teachers and students typically have no further interaction. If the student goes on to do well in life or not, the teacher probably wouldn't know. The parents of the students do experience ongoing consequences based on the effects of years of school programming. They interact with those students throughout year after year, and then after the students become adults, typically their parents are still going to interact with them. In the cases where adult children don't interact with their parents anymore, we might wonder, why is that the case? Why is that? Why do those patterns of estrangement vary from time to time and place to place? Why are there patterns of estrangement that what causes these patterns of estrangement? We could be curious about this, and I'm not really going to focus on that any, but this issue of how schools program students could be related to the kinds of relationships that those students have with their parents as those students get older, during the years of school as well as after the years of school. So what is the focus of the teacher? Again, the teacher either pleases their supervisor and gets to keep their job, or loses their job. We would assume by not pleasing their supervisors. So the clarity and comprehension of the individual student typically has no lasting consequence whatsoever for the school system or its individual employees. To some extent, we can say that when the school system produces good taxpayers, then that is good for the school system. But that's a kind of a stretch. And the individual school districts so often are not where those students live the rest of their life. Students move to different counties, different states, different parts of a city, different school districts within a local area. So the individual schools that uh, uh, work with an individual student may have no consequence ever in regard to the ongoing life of that student. So if the students do well enough on standardized testing to attract certain kinds of incentive funding for the next school year, that's the basic target. The school system has fulfilled its core purpose if the students do well enough on standardized testing to attract whatever incentive funding is available. So there's like the baseline of funding. Then if a school can classify a lot of students as special needs students and therefore attract more funding, then they want to classify students as special needs students or whatever gets the school system more funding. And then typically you would expect that the schools want to keep students in that high level of funding category. So whatever category gets the most funding, schools don't want to have kids go into that category briefly. They want a lot of kids in those highly funded categories, and they want those kids to stay there. That's the natural incentive of most school systems that I'm familiar with. So what is taught? Comply with the rulers to receive rewards. That's what the teachers do. That's what the students do. How you receive rewards, comply with the rulers. Disrupting the system, at least disrupting it more than a little, will be severely punished. Disrupting it a little might be ignored, but disrupting it more than a little will be severely punished. How do you receive rewards? Comply with the rulers. So are these important lessons for teaching professionals and students to learn? Well, failing to quickly learn those lessons certainly can lead to unfavorable consequences. So we could say these are really valuable lessons. The faster that students, teachers, etc. Learn these lessons, the better. However, these are just one type of lesson to learn. So that's what I had to say about a simple clarity in contrast to confusion, controversy. I'll say more about confusion in the next video, and kind of the how school systems relate to confusion, how they can promote confusion, and then the contrast between the experience of having a clear priority and dilemmas of paranoid perfectionism or dilemmas of perfectionist paranoia. In other words, confusion. Clear priority, no clear priority. Haziness, no focus, easily distracted, low satisfaction, ongoing discontent because there's no clear priority and no fulfillment of a clear priority. So discontent is the normal experience for many people who including people who go through mainstream school systems. Certainly people who are not part of mainstream school systems can also have similar experiences. So the focus again isn't in particular about schools. I just think that's a really interesting framework to discuss some of these ideas. So the next video, like I said, is a clear priority versus dilemmas, agonizing over dilemmas of paranoid perfectionism.